Hi, my name is Justin Hussey, and my research project is History Repeats Itself, Napoleon and Hitler in Russia. We've all heard the phrase, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. There is a later iteration of this quote from Winston Churchill that says, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That line spoke to me when looking into topics for a research paper. What could I examine that truly embodied that experience? Has there been a leader in history who committed a major blunder based on their own hubris? Immediately, I thought about Napoleon and Hitler's invasions of Russia and how eerily similar their defeats were. Napoleon had an idea and tried it, and it was an utter disaster. And what was Hitler's excuse? He did almost the same exact thing and failed in almost the same exact way. Why did he think he could do it better? Maybe it was because he had tanks and planes and Napoleon had horses. Maybe he felt it was his God-given right. I chose to focus on both campaigns and dig a little into the why and how of each one. The French Revolution and its aftermath have always really interested me. It was a time of complete chaos at the hands of the lower classes due to unequal resource division, and it made waves all over the world. Napoleon's immediate rise and bold conquest are tied to the spirit of revolution pervading the French people during this time. And Napoleon was able to become this embodiment of spirit within his military ambitions. He likened himself to a Roman emperor and commissioned art of himself painted like the great conquerors throughout history. Napoleon had country-specific goals in mind for each one of his campaigns. Great Britain had become a major enemy of the French, and one of Napoleon's goals was to engage other nations in an embargo against British goods. In 1807, he entered into an uneasy truce with Russia and its leadership to keep this embargo alive. And by 1812, the agreement had been broken and Russia had resumed trade with Great Britain. So Napoleon undertook a massive assault on Russian soil. Napoleon had an army of about 615,000 strong. It was one of the largest armies in European history. His goal was to make swift work of Russian armed forces in small cities and then eventually take Moscow and before the winter kicked in. He set out in June of 1812, assuming that would be enough time for victory, and he was mistaken. His army traveled by foot and horses with large amounts of artillery. Their movement was very slow going, yet they were met with surprisingly low resistance as they moved through. Unbeknownst to them, Russia had decided to engage in a war of attrition, essentially drawing them further and further away from supply lines and putting them in a position to succumb to the lack of resources and harsh elements. As French forces marched further into Russian territory, they found cities left empty, sacked of all of its food and resources before they got there. Supplies were running low, and with such a large army, there was a drastic need for a solution. Napoleon set his sights on Moscow, determined not to show any weakness. And when the French forces finally arrived at the city, it had been ransacked by Russian forces, evacuated, and left in flames. French forces were forced to hold up in the desolated city while winter began to take hold. Eventually, they had to admit defeat and retreat through the harsh winter conditions back to a more familiar country. Napoleon went to war with Russia with 615,000 men. He left with less than 100,000. Russia's scorched earth strategy and hard environmental conditions left French forces in ruins, and Napoleon's drastic defeat led to his exile and his removal from power. Now, this seems like a very straightforward lesson for any student of history. Adolf Hitler certainly was a student of history, and he had a great respect for Napoleon on many levels. Though as he experienced his own rise to power, he began to feel invincible. If you read his words, there's almost a dogmatic belief that he is destined to bring balance back to Earth, that God had given him this path forward. It's delusional, but it also possibly explains why Hitler felt he could launch a similar offensive and be successful where Napoleon failed. In the years between Napoleon's reign and Hitler's rise, weaponry had made several significant advances. World War I and its aftermath brought about the creation of several new kinds of weapons, including small-scale grenades, chemical weapons, tanks, and machine guns. The world saw the creation of airplanes, missiles, and radio communications. Hitler had assembled an army of about 3.5 million Germans for his attack on Russia, and he named this attack Operation Barbarossa, and this was named after a Roman emperor. Ultimately, his plan was to take out the Jewish populations within the Russian society and take eastern borders for Germany influence and role. Hitler believed that with his large numbers and advanced weapons, he could make swift work of the Russians and arrive in Moscow within a 10-week time frame. And just like Napoleon, he was mistaken. Germany did see several victories as they first pushed into Russian territory. Hitler had commissioned several specialty troops called Panzer forces, Panzer being named after the German tank, and they had experienced success on that advance. For the main artillery and supply troops, it was a different story. Advances were slow moving, and the groups that had gone ahead found themselves waiting long amounts of time for supplies. Hitler's 10-week plan was stalled, and suddenly Germany found itself forced to draw out their timeline into the dreaded winter months. In October of 1941, Germany advanced on Moscow. Autumn in Russia is mud season, and their advances slowed to a crawl. By the time they got to Moscow, the Russian had assembled forces from all corners of the country, and Germany was entering into a siege in the Russian winter, for which they were woefully unprepared. Eventually, they would be forced to retreat, and the weak German forces would be sent to other battlegrounds. The failed mission had a ripple effect on German forces throughout the rest of the war, and the Soviets certainly didn't forget when they eventually took Berlin in 1945. So now we have two failed campaigns from two pragmatic leaders, and why did this happen twice? One, neither leader truly accounted for how large and arduous the Russian landscape is to maneuver. And two, Russian winter. And this is the biggest factor of all. The Russian climate is not forgiving, and there are really only a few months out of the year that lend themselves to major military operations over land before you enter into mud season in a long freezing winter. Both leaders underestimated the amount of time it would take them to journey to Moscow, and neither had a contingency for wintering in such a brutal Arctic climate. They both planned assaults as if they were attacking another country in Western Europe, and that was a misstep. Napoleon made a grievous error in judgment, and Hitler had an opportunity to learn from this, but instead, he believed that God had given him the resources to do better. In the end, Mother Nature always wins. As current students of history, we can certainly take a lesson here. When looking at similar past events, you need to consider all the variables.